Alex Rider, Book 6, Chapter 4. Casper. You're in pain, that's all you know. Your head is pounding and your heart is throbbing, and you wonder if someone has managed to tie a knot in your neck. It is a feeling that Alex Rider knew all too well. He had been knocked out by Mr. Grin when he was at the Stormbreaker assembly plant, but by the vicious Miss Stellenbosch at the Academy of Point Blanc, and by Nile at the Windows Palace in Venice. Even Alan Blunt had gone of his men to fire a tranquilizer dart into him when he had first infiltrated the headquarters of MI6, and it was no different to this time. The slow climb back from nothing to a world of air and light. Alex became aware that he was lying down, his cheek pressed against the dusty wooden floor. There was an unpleasant taste in his mouth. With an effort he opened his eyes and then closed them again as the light from a naked bulb dangling overhead burned into them. He waited and opened them a second time. Slowly he straightened his legs and stretched his arms and thought exactly what he thought every time it happened. You're still alive. You're a prisoner, but for some reason they haven't killed you yet. Alex dragged himself into a sitting position and looked around him. He was in a room that was completely bare, no carpet, no curtains, no furniture, no decorations, nothing. There was a wooden door, presumably locked, and a single window. He was surprised to see that it was in bed, but when he staggered over to it, he understood why. He was high up, 7 or 8 stories. Door was only just breaking, and it was hard to see through the dirty glass, but he guessed he'd been unconscious for a few hours, and that he was still in London. It looked like he was being held in an abandoned tower block. There was another block opposite, and looking up, Alex could just see a huge banner strung between 2 wires, running from the top of one building to the other. The first words were outside his field of vision, but he could make out the rest. Towers, soon to be an exciting new development for East London. He went over to the door and tried it just in case. It didn't move. His left arm was aching badly and massaged it, wondering how much damage he had done to himself. This was meant to be his last night in the hospital. How could he have allowed himself to get involved with a gang of murderers who had broken in? What for? Alex rested his shoulders against the wall and slid back down to the floor, cradling his arm. He was still barefooted and he shivered. His single shiver was enough to protest him against the chill of the early morning. Sitting there, he played back the events that had brought him here. 4 men had come into Dominic's, but they hadn't been interested in him. They had asked for the boy in the room next door, Paul Drevin. Suddenly, Alex remembered where he had heard the name. He'd seen it in the newspapers, but not Paul. Nicoli. That was it. Nicoli Drevin was some sort of Russian multi-billionaire. Well, that made sense. The men must have wanted his son for the most obvious reason. Money, but they had accidentally kidnapped him and said what they would do when they found out. Alex tried to put the thought out of his mind. He had seen how they dealt with Connor. Then the night receptionist, somehow, he didn't think they'd apologise and offer him the taxi fare home. But there was nothing he could do. He sat where he was, slumped against the wall, watching the sky turn from grey to red to a dull sort of blue. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, the door had opened and spectacles were standing over him, an expression of pure hatred on his face. Alex wasn't surprised. The last time they'd met, Alex had slammed a 10-kilogram oxygen tank into his groin. If there were any surprise, It was that just a few hours later the man had found the strength to stand. Spectacles was holding a gun. Alice looked into the man's eyes. They glinted orange behind the tinted glass and gazed at him in undisguised venom. "Get up," he snapped. You're to come with me." "Whatever you say." Alice got slowly to his feet. "Is it my imagination?" he asked. "Or is your voice a little higher than it used to be?" The hand with the gun twitched. "This way," Spectacles muttered. Alice followed him out into a corridor that was as dilapidated as the room where he had been confined. The walls were damp and peeling. Many of the ceiling tiles were missing, revealing great gaps filled with a tangle of wires and pipes. There were doors every 10 or 15 meters, some of them hanging off their hinges. Once they would have opened in the people's flats, but it was obvious that, apart from rats and cockroaches, nobody had lived here for years. Combat Jacket was waiting for them outside. He had recovered from an encounter with the medicine ball, but there was an ugly bruise on the side of his head where he had hit the wall. The two of them marched Alex down the corridor to a door at the end. "In," Spectacles said. Alex pushed open the door and went through. He found himself in a large open space with litter strewn across the floor and graffiti everywhere. There were windows on two sides, some of them covered by broken blinds. Alex guessed he was inside one of the flats, although partition walls had been smashed to make a single area. He could see an abandoned bath in one corner. In the middle there was a table and two chairs. A man was sitting there, waiting for him. Spectacles prodded his gun into Alex's back, and he stepped forward and sat down. With a shiver, he examined the man sitting opposite him. He was dressed in what might once have been a uniform, but the jacket was torn and missing buttons. The man must have been about 30 years old, but it was impossible to be sure. His face and head had been tattooed all over. Alex saw the United States of America reaching down one cheek, Europe on the other. His nose and skin above his lips were blue, the colour of the Atlantic Ocean. Brazil and West Africa touched the corners of his mouth. As the man turned around, Alex knew he would see Russia and China. He had never seen anything quite so strange, or so revolting in his life. With difficulty, Alex tore his eyes away and looked round. Combat Jacket and Spectacles were standing on either side of the doorway. Silvertooth was lurking in the corner. Alex hadn't noticed him in the shadows, but now he stepped into the light. Alex saw that his neck was swollen, two angry red marks burning into the skin. There was no sign of steel watch. Perhaps they'd been unable to peel him off the magnetum. The man with the tattoos spoke. "You have caused us a great deal of annoyance," he said. "In truth, you should be dead." Alex was silent. He wasn't sure yet what to say. "My name is Casper," the man continued. Alex shrugged but said nothing. The man continued to examine him. "Why were you out of your room last night?" "I needed some air." "It would have been better if you had simply opened the window," Casper said. When he spoke, the whole countenance moved. It occurred to Alex that if he sneezed, it would set off a global earthquake. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "No," Alex replied. But it would be useful to have you around in the geography exam. I wouldn't have thought you were in any position to make jokes." Casper's voice was flat and unemotional. He just said the other night, You have caused my colleagues a great deal of pain and inconvenience. Would like me to go? Perhaps I will." "What do you want me for?" Alex demanded. "I will tell you." Casper ran a finger down the side of his face. It travelled from Norway to Algeria. "I can see that you are surprised by my appearance. You may think it extreme, but these markers represent who I am and what I believe in. We are all part of this world. I remain the world part of me. He paused. I'm what you might call a freedom fighter, but the freedom I believe in is a planet free of the exploitation and pollution caused by rich businessmen and multinationals who would destroy all life simply to enrich themselves. We have global warming. The ozone layer has been decimated. Our precious resources are fast running out, but still these fat cats continue lining their pockets today, with no thought or care for tomorrow. Your father is such a man. My father? You've got it all wrong. The man moved incredibly quick. He stood up and lashed out, hitting the side of Alex's head with the back of his head. Alex snapped, more startled than hurt. Don't interrupt, Casper commanded. Your father made his fortune from oil. His pipelines had scarred the 3 continents, and now, not content with damaging Earth, he is turning his attention to outer space. 4 species of wild bird had been made extinct by the launch of his rockets from the Caribbean. 8 chimpanzees had been unwilling victims of his test flights. He is an enemy of mankind and has therefore become a legitimate target of Force 3. Casper sat down. These are those who think of us as criminals. He went on, but it is your father who is the real criminal. He has forced us to act the way we do. Now we have decided to make him pay. He will give us £1 million for your safe return. This money will be used to continue our struggle to protect the planet. If he refuses, he will never see you again. That is why you were taken to St. Dominic's last night. You will remain with us until the ransom has been paid. I do not personally wish to harm you, Paul. We have to prove to your father that we have you. We must send him a message that he cannot ignore, and I'm afraid that will demand a small sacrifice from you. And he tried to speak when his hand was reading. It was all happening too fast, but before he could react, his right arm was seized from behind. His right arm was seized from behind. Combat jacket had crept up on him while Casper had been talking. Alex tried to resist, but the man was too strong. The cuff of his shirt was ripped open and the sleeve pulled back. Then his hand was forced down on the table and the fingers spread out one by one. There was nothing he could do. Combat Jack was holding him so tightly his fingers were turning white. Silvertooth approaching from the other side. He had taken out his knife. He handed it to Casper. We could send your father a photograph, Casper explained. But what would that achieve? He will know by now that you have been taken by force. There are stronger ways of making our demands known. Ways that he might find more persuasive. He lifted the knife close to his chin, as if about to shave. The blade was 15 centimeters long with serrated edge. He examined his reflection in the steel. We could send him a lock of your hair. He would, I'm sure, recognize it as yours, but then he might take it as a sign of weakness or of compassion on our part. As I apologize, Paul Draven. It gives me no pleasure to hurt a child, even a wealthy, spoilt child such as yourself. But what I intended to send to your father is a finger from your right hand. Automatically, Alex tried to pull back, but Combat Jacket had been expecting it. His full weight pressed down on Alex. His fingers were splayed, helpless on the table. The pay will be great, but there are children all over the world who have earned their pay as starvation. While boys like you languish in the playground of the rich. Do you play the piano, Paul? I hope not. It will not be so easy after today. He reached out and grabbed Alex's little finger. And that was the one he had chosen. Now began its journey down. I'm not Paul Draven! Alex spat out the words urgently. His hands had widened. He could feel the blood draining from his face. And I was still moving. You made a mistake, he says. You made a mistake, he says. My name is Alex Ryder. I was in room 9. I don't know anything about Paul Draven. The knife stopped. It was millimeters above his little fingers. Do it, Combat Jacket hissed. I was waiting last night, Alex insisted. The words came to me. I was coming back from the toilet. I saw you men outside my room. One of them pulled out a gun and then they began chasing me. I didn't know what was happening. I had to defend myself. He's lying, Combat Jacket said. I asked him his name. Dan Spectacles, tell him. That's right, Spectacles. We saw his roommate. It was empty. Then he appeared. We got out his name and he answered. Casper tightened his grip on the knife. He had made up his mind. I was in room 9, not 8, Alex was shouting now. He was swimming. He could always see the knife cutting through the flesh and bone. He could imagine the pain. And suddenly he had thought, what do you think I was in for hospital for? He demanded. We know what you were there for, Casper replied. Epidemics. Epidemics, right. Then look at my bandage. There's nowhere near my appendix. There was a long pause. I feel the Combat Jacket still pressing down hard long for the cutting to begin. But Casper was still uncertain. Open his shirt, he ordered. No, do moved. Do it. Combat Jacket was still holding Alex as tightly as ever, but now Silvertooth stepped forward. Reached out and grabbed hold of Alex's shirt, tearing the top 2 buttons. Casper stared at the bandages crossing over his chest. Alex could feel his heart straining beneath them. What is this? Casper demanded. I had a chest wound. What sort of chest wound? An accident on my bike. It was one lie Alex had told. He didn't tell them what had really happened. He didn't want them to know who he was. I met Paul Dravin, he admitted. He's the same age as me, but he doesn't look anything like me. Just make a phone call. You can find out easily enough. He took a deep breath. You can cut off all my things soon, but my father isn't going to pay you a penny. He doesn't even know I exist. There's another silence. He's lying, Combat Jacket insisted. The Casper was already working it out for himself. He had heard Alex speak. Paul Driven had a faint Russian accent. This boy had already lived in England all his life. Casper wanted to stab down with a knife. The blade buried itself in the table less than centimeters from Alex's hand. The hilt quivered as he released it. I saw disappointment in the faces of Spectacles. Silvertooth, but Casper had made his decision. Let him go. Combat Jacket held him tightly for a moment longer, then released his arm and stood back, muttering something ugly under his breath. Alex snatched back his hand. His right arm was hurting as much as his left one. He wondered if Casper was ready to take him back to the hospital. By the time he got out here, he would need it, but it wasn't over yet. Spectacles and Silvertooth were waiting to escort him, but Casper gestured for them to wait. He was examining Alex a second time, reassessing him. It was impossible to see behind the markings on his face, to know what was going on in his mind. It turns out that you are who you say you are. Really, you are not all driven. You are no use to us. We can kill you in a way that we please, and I think it will please my men to kill you very slowly indeed. But perhaps, my friend, it would have been better for you if there had been no mistake. Perhaps the loss of one finger might have been the easier way. Silvertooth was grinning. Spectacles on the gravy. Take it back to his room, Casper commanded. I will make the necessary inquiries, and then we'll meet again. Chapter 5. Fire Escape. It was late afternoon when the door opened and Combat Jacket came in. I guessed that he had been in the room for 8 hours. He had been allowed out once to use a chemical toilet, and at around midday he had been given a sandwich and a drink by an unsmiling Spectacles. The sandwich had been 2 days past its sell-by date and still in the plastic wrapping, brought from a garage, but Alex wolfed it down hungrily. Combat Jacket had been sent to fetch him. He led Alex down the corridor back to the flat where the interrogation had taken place. His face with its ugly broken nose giving nothing away. There was something about the whole setup that Alex didn't understand. Casper had told him they were freedom fighters, eco-warriors or whatever. They were certainly fanatics. The tutus were ample proof of that. But the way they were treating him, the threat, the demands for money seemed to belong to a different world. They talk about pollution and the ozone layer, but they acted like thugs. And common criminals. They had killed the nitrous receptionist for no good reason. They seemed to have no regard at all for human life. But by now, I guessed they must have known the truth. So what are we going to do with him? He remembered what Casper had said and clamped down on his imagination and said he searched for a way to break out of it. It wasn't going to be easy. The 4 men had already tested him once. They knew what he was capable of. They weren't going to give him a second chance. There was a newspaper on the table in front of him, but no sign of the knife. Spectacles and silver tooth was standing behind him. As Eric sat down, Casper turned the newspaper around. It was the Evening Standard, and the front page headline told the whole story in just 3 words. Wrong boy kidnapped. Nobody was talking, so I just quickly read the article. There was a photograph of St. Dominic's Hospital, but no surprise picture of him or Paul Drevin. That didn't surprise him. He remembered reading somewhere that Paul's father, Nicole Drevin, had managed to get an embargo on any photos of his family being published, claiming it was too much of a security risk. And of course MI6 would have prevented any picture of Alex being used. He didn't even get a mention by name. A security guard was murdered in a small house of the morning during a ruthless attack on a North London hospital. Seaborn was certain that the intended target of the gang was 14-year-old Paul Drevin, son of one of the world's richest men, Rush businessman Nicole Drevin. Drevin made his headlines earlier this year when he had bought Stratford East Football Club. He is also the guiding light behind the £100 billion Archangel project. He's also the guiding light behind the £100 billion Archangel project, the first hotel in space. So now we know what Archangel is. The 6th book, we know what it is. Archangel. It's the name of the 6th book. And Archangel, we now know, is the first hotel in space. In an astonishing development, police have confirmed that the gang managed to kidnap the wrong boy. This other boy, who had not been named, was discovered to be missing from his room. Following major surgery, speaking from the hospital, Dr. Roger Hayward made an urgent plea for the boy's fast return. His condition is said to be stable but serious. Alex looked up. Casper seemed waiting for him to speak. I told you, he said. So why don't you let me go? I've got nothing to do with this. I was just next door. You got involved on purpose, Casper said. No, Alex denied it, but his mouth was dry. You switched room numbers. You answered to the name of Paul Drevin. You crippled one of my men and injured the other. Alex said nothing, waiting for the axe to fall. I don't understand why you chose to become involved, Casper went on. I don't know who you are, but you made your decision. You chose to become an enemy of Force 3, and so you must pay. I didn't choose anything. I'm not going to argue with you. I am fighting a war, and in any war, there are casualties, innocent victims who just happen to get in their way. If it makes it any easier, think of yourself as one of them. Casper sighed, but there was no sadness casting out in the map of his face. Goodbye, Lex Rider. It was a pity that we had to meet. It had cost me £1 million in ransom money. It would cost you rather more. But before Alex could react, he was grabbed from behind and dragged to his feet. He didn't speak, and he was forced back out of the room and down the corridor. This time he was thrown into another room, smaller than his previous cell. Alex just had time to make out a chair, a bed, window, and 4 bare walls before he was shoved hard in the back and sent sprawling to the floor. Combat jacket over him. I wish he'd let me have a little time with you, he asked. If I had it my way, we'd do this differently. Move it! The voice came from outside. One of the other men was waiting. Alex spat and eyes and walked out. The door closed, and almost at once, Alex heard the unmistakable sound of hammering. He shook his head in disbelief. They weren't just looking at him. They were nailing the door to the frame. Once again, he examined his surroundings. He wondered why they had chosen this particular room. The bars and the windows made no real difference. Even if the windows had been wide open, he was at least 7 stories up. He wouldn't have been able to climb out. And what exactly were they proposing to do? They obviously weren't planning to come back and get him. We're simply going to leave him here to starve to death. The answer came out an hour later. The sun was beginning to set and lights were coming on in buildings all over East London. Alice was becoming increasingly anxious. He was on his own, high up in a derelict tower block. He had the feeling that Casper and the others had gone. He did nothing at all, and not on the other side of the door. The sound was unnerving. He knew that MI6 would be doing everything they could, searching the city for him, but what hope did they have of finding him here? He couldn't open the window, the room was empty. There was no way he could attract anyone's attention. For once he really did seem to be completely helpless. And then he smelled it, seeping through the floorboards, coming from somewhere deep in the heart of the building. Burning. They had set fire to the tower block. Alex knew it even before he saw the first grey wisps of smoke creeping under the door. They had doused the place with petrol, set it alight, and left him nailed inside what would soon be the world's biggest funeral pyre. For a moment he felt panic, black and irresistible, and as it engulfed him, more smoke was curling under the door. Alex sprang to his feet and backed over to the window, wondering if there was some way he could knock out the glass, but that wouldn't help him. He forced himself to slow down to think. He wasn't going to let them kill him. Only 11 days ago, a Payde Sane had fired a .22 caliber bullet at his heart. But he was still alive. He wasn't easy to kill. There were just two ways out of this room, the door and the window. Both of those were obviously hopeless, but what about the walls? They were made of hardboard and plaster. In the flat, where he had been interrogated, they had been knocked through. Maybe he could do the same here. Experimentally, he ran his hands over them, pushing, probing, searching for any weak spots. His throat was sore and his eyes were beginning to water. More and more smoke was pouring in. He stood back and then lashed out in a karate kick, his foot smashing into the centre of the wall. Pain shot up his leg and through the body. That the wall didn't even crack. I just left the ceiling. Alice remembered the corridor outside. It had been missing some of its ceiling tiles, and he had seen a gap underneath the pipes and wires that ran above. The ceiling in this room was covered with the same tiles, and they had left him a chair. He dragged it to the corner of the room nearest the door and stood on it. The floor had almost disappeared beneath the swirling carpet of smoke. It seemed to be reaching up as if it wanted to grab hold and devour him. Alex checked his balance, then punched upwards with the heel of his hand. The tiles were made of some sort of fiberboard and broke easily. He punched again, then tore out the edges of the hole he had made. Dirt and debris showered down, almost blinding him. When he next looked up, he saw that there was a space above him. If he could reach it, he could haul himself up and over the door and jump down the other side. He ripped out more tiles until the hole was wide enough to squeak through. He could hear something a few floors below him. A faint crackling, that's the sound that made his skin crawl. It meant that the fire was getting close. He forced himself to concentrate on what he was doing. The chair was wobbling underneath him. If he fell and twisted an ankle, he was finished. At last he was ready. He tensed himself, then jumped. He felt the chair topple and crash to the floor, but he had done it. His hands caught hold of an old water pipe, and now he was dangling just above the ceiling, his arms disappearing into the space above. Once again, he was all too aware of the stitches in his chest, and wondered briefly if they would hold. God, the FISO people had told him he ought to keep up his stretching exercise, but he doubted they'd had this in mind. Gritting his teeth, he summoned all his strength to pull himself up into the cavity. His face passed through a cobweb and grimaced as the fine strands laced themselves over his nose and mouth. His stomach touched the edge of the hole. He was half in and half out of the room. The crawl space was in front of him. The wall with the door was underneath him. Dozens of wires and insulated pipes ran inches above his head, stretching into the distance. Dust stung in his eyes. What now? Alex dragged himself along the pipe, bringing his feet up into the ceiling recess. He kicked down with more heels. More ceiling tiles fell loose, and he saw the corridor below. There was a drop of about 4 meters. Awkwardly, he swung himself forward, then his legs and torso hung. Finally, he let go and dropped down, landing in the crouch. He was in the corridor on the other side of the locked door. With a sigh of relief, he straightened up. He was out of the room, but he was at least 7 floors up in an abandoned building that had been set on fire. He wasn't safe yet. The crackling of the flames was louder out in the corridor. The block of flats had seemed damp and musty to Alex, but it was going up like a torch. He could feel the heat of the air. The end of the corridor waved interrogated was already shimmering in the heat haze. Where was the fire brigade? Surely someone must have see what was happening. Alex noticed a fire alarm set in the wall, but the glass was already broken and the alarm button was missing. He would have to get out of here on his own. Which way? He only had two choices, left or right, and he had decided to head away from the interrogation room. He hadn't seen the staircase when he had taken that to meet Casper, but there might be one in the other direction. Smoke trickled up through the floorboards. It hung eerily in the doorways. Soon it would be impossible to see. Very soon it would be impossible to breathe. He sprinted past the first room where he had been held and continued down the corridor, passing a set of lift doors. He didn't even think about trying the lift. Nothing in the building worked and the doors were welded shut. But next to the left he found what he was looking for, a staircase leading up and down. The steps were made of concrete zigzagging round behind the lift shaft. He rested his hands briefly on the metal stair rail. It was hot. The fire was near, but he had no choice. He began to run down, his bare feet slapping against the cement. He just had a hope he didn't come across any broken glass. There were 25 steps between each floor. He counted them without meaning to. He turned a corner and saw a door leading into a smoke-filled corridor. Definitely no way out there. The further down he went, the worse it got. 25 more steps and he came to another door. The corridor on the other side was well alight. There were brilliant red and orange flames tearing into the walls, leaping up through the floor, devouring everything in their path. Alex was shocked by their speed and elemental strength. He had to put a hand up to protect himself, to stop his cheeks from burning. He continued down. Force 3 had started to blaze on the ground floor, allowing the air to carry the flames upward. The third floor he began the next flight of steps down. He could barely breathe. The smoke was smothering him. He wished he thought to soak his shirt in water to cover his eyes and mouth, but where would he have found water in the building anyway? Another 25 steps and another. Eye was choking. He could feel sweat dripping down his side. It was like being inside a giant oven. How much further? He saw daylight, a door leading out onto the street. And that was when the combat jacket appeared, a nightmare creature stepping out of nowhere as if in slow motion. His gun raised in front of him. Alex saw the muzzle flash and threw himself backwards as a bullet shot past centimetres above him. He landed awkwardly on the stairs and he was already rolling as a second bullet spat into the concrete, sending fragments of cement flying into the side of his face. Somehow he scrambled to his feet and began to climb up. Again, combat fired twice more, but for a brief moment the smoke was on Alex's side, and the bullets missed. Alex turned the corner. He didn't stop until he was back on the first floor. He felt sick, a mixture of fury and despair. He had almost made it. What was Combat Jackie doing there? Waiting for him? Had he guessed that Alex might somehow manage to escape? It made no sense, but he could think about it now. He was still trapped inside a burning building, and he was rapidly running out of options. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. He looked along the corridor. It was a furnace. He couldn't let go that way. He couldn't go down, let only lift up. Rarely he started to climb. He made it to the second floor with just seconds to spare. As he continued up, there was a sudden rush of flames and a crash as part of the ceiling collapsed. Burning wood, metal and glass cascaded down. The fire had reached the stairs, now the way down. A plane dipped out of the sky, making for the city. There's no way now. The way down was permanently blocked. He would have to try and make it to the roof. Perhaps he would be lucky. The police and fire brigade would be on their way. There might be helicopters. Alex kept climbing. His hands were black. His face was streaked with tears. But he didn't stop. At the very worst, he would die in the open air. He wasn't going to let the fire finish him here. He was no longer counting the steps. His legs were aching, and bandages around his chest had come loose. He ran past the 8th floor with a growing sense of despair. This was where he had begun. 4th and so on. He continued to climb past the 9th, 10th and 11th and 12th. He was aware of the flames chasing him, very in the stair, but looking at his heels, it was as if the fire knew he was there and was afraid of losing him. At last he came to a solid door with a metal push mechanism. He slammed his palms against it, terrified it would be locked, but the door swung open. Cool evening air rushed to greet him. The sun had set by the sky was a brilliant red, the same colour as the fire that would be with him all too soon. Ernest was close to exhaustion. He had barely eaten all day. He was meant to be in bed. He almost wanted to cry, but instead he swore once, shouting out the ugly word. Then he wiped a grimly sleeve across his face and looked round. He was on the roof, 15 stories up. He could see a water tank in front of him and a brick building that housed the cables for the lift. Well, there was no working lift and there was probably no water either, so neither of them would help. Some stage builders must have carried out some work up here. They had left a few lengths of scaffolding and plastic piping, as well as a cement mixer, and two steel buckets, both half filled with cement that had long ago dried and solidified. I ran to the edge of the roof, searching for a fire escape down. He could feel the tarmac against the soles of his feet. It was already hot. Soon it would begin to melt. There was no fire escape. There was no way down. He could see the streets far below. No cars, no pedestrians. He was in some sort of industrial district in East London. The whole area looked like it was cordoned off, waiting for the money that would make redevelopment possible. The building opposite was identical to this one, similarly condemned. It stood less than 50 metres away, connected by the banner that Alex had seen when he woke up. Hornchurch Towers, soon to be an exciting development for East London. He had come here in a year's time. He might have found himself standing on a balcony of a fabulous penthouse flat. Alex took in the view. He could see the river Thames in front of him. The O2 Arena sat on a spur of land with the water bending round it. A plane dipped out of the sky, making for the city airport, which he could see over his shoulders. Alex raised his arm, waving for attention, but he knew at once there was no good. The plane was top high up. It was already too dark, and the smoke was too thick. He hurried back to the door. He would have to head down again and hope that the upper corridors were still passable. Maybe he could try the other side of the building. He pulled the door open carefully, and it seemed impossible that combat jacket would have followed him, but he wasn't taking any chances. But the door swung wide. He realized that combat jacket was the least of his problems. A fist of flame punched at him. The stairs had become an inferno. At the same moment there was an explosion. Alex was hurled backwards by 1,000 fragments of burning, splintered wood, which would have been blasted up from below. He landed painfully on his back, and when he looked up, the door itself was now on fire. It was the only way off the roof. He was trapped. Alex stood up. The tarmac was definitely getting hotter. He could no longer stay too long on one foot. Black smoke was pouring out of the stairwell, billowing into the sky. Now he had the sounds he had been hoping for, the wail of sirens, but he knew that by the time they got to him, it would be too late. There was another explosion below him. The windows were beginning to shatter, unable to take the heat. No way down. What could he do? The banner. It was 20 metres long, about 100 metres off the ground, a lifeline between this and building and the next. The advertisement for the Hornchurch Towers was suspended between two steel cables. The top cable was level with the roof, bolted into the brickwork. Alex ran over to it. Could he stand on the lower cable and hold on to the tired one? It would be like a swing bridge in the jungle. Eagle slowly inched his way across to the other side in safety. But the cables were too far apart, and the material was flapping in the wind. It would knock him off before he was even halfway. But could he somehow crawl across on his hands and knees? No, the cable was about 2 centimetres thick. It wasn't wide enough to support him. He would lose his balance and fall, that was certain. So how? The answer came to him in an instant. Everything he needed was there in front of him, but it only worked when he put it all together. Could he do it? Another window shattered. Behind him, the accident had disappeared in a whirlwind of flames and smoke. He was standing on a giant hot plate, and it was becoming more unbearable with every passing second. Alex could see the fire engines the size of toys speeding along about half a mile away. He had to try. There was no other way. He snatched up one little length of plastic piping, weighed it in his hand. It was about 6 metres long and light enough for him to carry without feeling any strain. He had to examine the steel buckets. They were half full of hardened cement and weighed about the same. Somehow he had to attach them to the piping. There's no rope. He choked and wiped sweat and tears from his eyes. What could he do? He looked down and saw the bandages flapping around his chest. He grabbed an end and began to tear them off. 60 seconds later, he was ready. It was Iron Rider he had to thank, of course. A visit to the circus in Vienna 6 years ago when Alex was only 8. I'm 8. It had been his birthday, and he still remembered his favourite act, the tightrope walkers. Finalism, Iron Rider said. What's that? It's Latin, Alex. Funis means rope, and ambulare is to walk. Finalism is the art of tightrope walking. Is it difficult? Well, it's a lot easier than it looks. Not many people realise it, but there's a trick involved. Alex lifted the plastic pole, the middle pressed against his chest, about 3 meters stretching out each side. There was a heavy steel bucket attached to each end, tied in place with a torn bandage. Every second he waited, he could feel the heat increasing. His soles were already blistering, and he knew that he couldn't wait any more. He walked to the edge of the roof. The metal cable running above the advertisement stretched out into the distance. Suddenly the other tower block seemed a very long way away. He tried not to look down. He knew that would make it impossible for him to begin. This was how it was meant to work. This was what Iron Rider had explained. The wire acts as an axis. If you try to walk across the wire, you will fall the moment that your centre of mass is not directly above it. One wobble and gravity will do the rest. The long pole increases what is called the rotational inertia of the tightrope artist. It makes it more difficult to fall, and if you add enough weight to each end, you would actually shift your centre of the gravity below the wire. This was what Alex had done with the 2 buckets. Provided he didn't drop the pole, he would find it impossible to lose his balance. He had seen the toys that worked on the same principle. It should be easy. At least, that was the theory. Alex took a step, and 1 foot on the very edge of the brickwork, and 1 foot on the metal cable. All he had to do was lean forward, transferring his weight from 1 foot to the other, and he would be walking the tightrope. If the laws of 5-6 work, he would make it across. If they didn't, he would die. It was as simple as that. He took a deep breath and launched himself off the building. He could feel the pole flexing as the buckets hung down, one on each side. For a terrifying moment, the world seemed to lurch sideways, and he was certain he was about to fall. But he forced himself not to panic. He clutched the pole more tightly against his chest and focused on the cable ahead of him. Briefly, he closed his eyes, warning himself not to fight for balance, to let the laws of physics guide him. And it worked. He wasn't falling. He could feel a cable cutting into his feet, but miraculously, he was stable. Now, how many steps to the other side? The flames were warming his back. It was time to move, one step after another. He made his way across. He wanted to look down. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to do just that. And his neck and spine were rigid with tension. That was the one thing he must not do. He tried to imagine that he was back on the sports field at Brookland. He was back on the sports field in Brookland. It meant that he was back on the sports field in Brookland School. He had walked along the painted white lines often enough. This was exactly the same, just a bit higher up. He was about halfway across when things began to go wrong. They went wrong spectacularly. First, the police and fire engines arrived. Alex heard the screams and sounds directly beneath him, and before he could stop himself, he looked down. It was a mistake. He was no longer walking across the sports field. He was standing on a wire, insanely far above the ground. He saw people in uniform pointing up at him and shouting. He could just about hear their voices. One of the fire trucks was extending its ladder towards him, but he doubted it would reach him in time. The whole world began to spin. He felt a rush of panic that seemed to resolve every muscle in his body, and left him so weak that he thought he would faint. At the same time, the wind rose and the banner began to flutter like the sail of a yacht. The cable swayed from side to side. Alex knew, keeping him upright, he was paralyzed. There was nothing he could do. That was when the rooftop exploded. The flames had finally broken free. A fireball burst through the tarmac. The police and firemen dived for cover as bricks of pieces of metal rained down. The whole tower block was close to collapse. Alex felt a vibration travel up through his body. He realized with horror that the metal station holding the top cable was about to come loose. He couldn't wait for the fireman to reach him. He had perhaps seconds left. The shock of the explosion brought his paralyzed, and he ran, pushing against the pole like a sprinter, breaking through the finishing line. The bucket swung madly, held fast by the bandages. Another explosion, louder this time. He didn't dare look around. The other building was getting near, but it still was near enough. His arms were aching, barely able to hold the heavy weight. The cable was cutting into his feet. He was being battered by the wind. He wasn't going to make it. And then the cable snapped. Alex had heard a sound like a crack of a whip and knew that his life had been severed. With a cry, he dropped the pole and threw himself forward, reaching out for the roof just a few meters away. The cable and banner crumbled under his feet. His hands missed the edge of the building and he began to plunge down, but he was tangled up with the banner. It was folding itself around him, and he grabbed hold of the material and gasped as he crashed into the wall. His feet was dangling in space, but the cable was unraveling beneath him. It was instead attached to the rooftop, just a few meters above his head. Alex waited until he was sure nothing else was moving. Then painfully, he began to pull himself up. Two of the firemen had managed to reach the roof. They were standing there watching as the building opposite completed a spectacular collapse. They heard a noise and looked down. A boy had just crawled up over the edge, right by their feet. His shirt was in rags and a few tattered bandages trailed from his chest. His face and hands were covered in soot. His hair was black with sweat. What the... They grabbed hold of him and pulled him to safety. And he sat down heavily. He gazed at the remains of the building where he had been held prisoner. There was very little of it left. Sparks leapt into the darkness of the sky. Nice night for a walk, he said, and passed out. Chapter 6. R and R. R and R. R and R. Jack Starbright made the best scrambled eggs in the world. The secret, she said, was to use only free-range eggs, mix them with unsalted butter and a little mix, and then get the whole thing over with as quickly as possible. She didn't enjoy cooking and only used recipes that she could prepare in less than 10 minutes. This breakfast, for example, would go from fridge to table in exactly 8.5. It would go to the fridge in exactly 8.5. She heaped the eggs onto 2 plates, added grilled bacon, tomato and toast, and carried them over to the kitchen table where Alex Ryder was waiting. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, and the two of them were back in the house in Chelsea, where Alex had once lived with his uncle. Jack had first come there as a student, paying for her room. By looking after Alex while I was away, gradually she had become a sort of housekeeper. Now, she was Alex's legal guardian and also his best friend. Alex was wearing tracksuit trousers and a loose t-shirt. His hair was still wet from the shower. 2 days had passed since his confrontation with Force 3, and he was already looking a lot like his old self. Although Jack had noticed that he was still massaging his left arm, she put the plates down and poured 2 mugs of tea. Neither of them spoke. Alex had been taken straight back to the hospital after his dramatic escape. None of the firemen could believe what they had seen, and assumed they had been sent to rescue someone who had trained at the circus. Once again, MI6 had been forced to clamp down on the press reports. Photographs of Alex on the wire had appeared in the newspaper all over the world, but he had been too far away to be recognised, and his name was kept out of it. An ambulance had rushed him away before any journalists arrived, and by 10 o'clock that night, he was back in his old bed at St. Dominic's. He fell asleep at once. The next morning, he was woken by the nurse, Diana Meacher, coming into his room. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Alex replied. "Was that really you on the roof? I saw it on the news last night." She went over to the window and raised the blinds. "Everyone's talking about it, although we've all been told we're not allowed to." She came back to the bed and slipped a thermometer into his mouth. "And those men who broke in, we all know what you did and we think you're incredibly brave." "Thank you," I said with difficulty. "I'd watch out, though. If I were you, Dr. Hayward's hopping mad. He says he didn't spend hours operating on you just for you to get nearly killed a second time. He'll be here shortly." She removed the thermometer and examined it. "Your temperature is normal, though I'd say it's the only thing about you that is." Later that morning, Dr. Hayward came in, and he seemed less than cheerful. He gave Alex a thorough checkup, starting with his blood pressure and pulse rate, and moving on to examine his wound. He barely spoke a word as he did it. "It's lucky that you keep yourself fit," he remarked at last. He looked and spoke like a long-suffering headmaster. "All those shenanigans could have caused you serious damage, but it looks as if your stitches have held you, and you're generally in one piece. When can I go home?" "We'll just keep you here until the end of the day. I'm afraid the people you work for want to speak to you." "I don't work for anyone," Alex said. "Well, you know who I mean. Anyway, there's always a chance your system will react against the beating you've given it. So I want you to stay in bed today, and I'll come in and have another look at you after tea." He stood up and one last thing, Alex. I'm going to prescribe you at least 2 weeks rest and recuperation. I absolutely insist on it. Can I go back out to school?" "I'm afraid not. Just over a week ago, you were having a major surgery. I know you've made an amazing recovery, but there are still sorts of risks, infections, and all the rest of it. 2 weeks holiday, Alex. No arguments." Dr. Hayward departed, and Alex was left on his own to kill some time. He went for a walk down the corridor past room 8. It was empty. Nobody had mentioned poor Drevin, and it seemed that the other boy had gone. There is nothing worse than being in hospital when you don't feel you need to be there. And by 11 o'clock, Alex was in a bad mood. Jack rang, and he told her not to come in. He would see her when she came to collect him. His next visitor arrived just before lunch. It wasn't the person he had expected. Yeah, he had realised that Amish would want to know what had happened at Hornchurch Towers, and that they would send someone to debrief him. He accepted Miss Jones, but instead it was John Crawley who arrived, dressed in a nasty blue blazer with a crest on the pocket, and holding a box of Rose's chocolates. Crawley had once claimed to be a personal manager, and Alex still wasn't sure what he did at MI6. He was in his late 30s with thinning hair and a rather worried-looking face. He looked like the sort of man who counted paper clips and kept his pencils in a special drawer. He sat down by the bed. Got you these?" He said, hanging over the chocolates. "Thank you, Mr. Crawley." Now that he was closer, Alex could see the badge on the jacket belonged to Royal Turnbridge Wells Golf and Croquet Club. Miss Jones apologised for not coming herself. She's in Berlin. She asked me to find out what's been going on. The police wanted to talk to you too, but I've had a word with them, and they won't be bothering you. How are you feeling, by the way? You were all very shocked by what happened. I had a run-in with Scorpio about 10 years ago, and it nearly did for me. Anyway, let's get back to 4th Street. What exactly happened?" Corey took out a miniature recording device and laid it on the bed. Quickly, as Alex took him through the events, starting with the moment the 4 men had walked into the hospital, it occurred to him that Corey had let slip a little clue about his past. He too had fought against Scorpio. Had he once been a field agent himself? Alex described the fight in the hospital, his meeting with Casper in the derelict flat, the ransom demand, and his escape from the fire. Corley blinked several times as Alex spoke, but didn't interrupt. "Well, that's quite an adventure," he commented when Alex had finished. "I remember when you and I first met. I could see straight away you were something special. I knew your father. I wasn't allowed to tell you that before. I worked with him a couple of times in the field. Yes, that was before Corey ran a hand through it. Well, I got hurt and I had to stop, but you're just like him. Remarkable. Anyway, I have a few questions, and then I'll leave you in peace." He had turned the recorder off, and now he switched it back on again. The man who interrogated you said his name. You say he called himself Casper. Can you describe him? That's easy, Mr. Crawley. He hasn't got the sort of face you'd forget. Tattoos? Tattoos? Yes, I described the man who had come so close to removing his little finger. He definitely told you that he represented Force 3. Yes, he talked a lot about global warming and that sort of thing. I would have said he rather added to it by setting fire to the building. I thought so too. What else can you tell me about him? Do you speak with an accent? I thought back. I don't think he was English. He might have had a slight French accent. I'm not sure. Corey nodded. Just one more question. The other 3 men in the tower block, you call them combat jacket, spectacles, and still two. Did you hear any names? No, I'm afraid not. Thank you, Alex. Corey pressed the button, and on the recorder, there's a click, and it stopped turning. So who's Casper? Who are Force 3? What was it all about? It's a long story. Well, I'm not going anywhere. Well, Corey began. Let's start with Nicoli. Drevin, I suppose you know who he is. I've heard of him. He is a Russian multi-millionaire. Born in Russia yet, but he's more of a multi-billionaire. As a matter of fact, an absolutely wonderful man. He lives in England and a lot of the time, and he's made it clear that he likes to think of himself as English. He bought a football club, Stratford East, that's right. He bought a football club. Stratford East, that's right. Nobody had ever heard of them, but he's forked out for some of the best players in the world. And now they're in Premiership. He has a huge place in Oxfordshire, a penthouse near Tower Bridge, and houses all over the world. He even has his own island in the Caribbean, Flamingo Bay. That's where the launches take place. Archangel, Alex said. Archangel is the name of a space hotel that he's building. It's being put together by piece. And he has to send rockets up and every now and then with the next component. You may not know this, Alex, but the British government are partners in the project, and it means a great deal to them. The first hotel in space, and it'll be flying a British flag. 10 years from now, commercial space travel will be reality. In fact, it already is. An American businessman had already gone into outer space, paid $20 million for the privilege. Once Archangel is up and running, more will follow. The most powerful and influential people in the world will be queuing up for tickets, and we'll be the ones supplying them. Casper mentioned outer space, Alex said. He didn't seem too happy about the idea. Casper is a fanatic, Corey replied. It's true that a few wild birds got wiped out on Flamingo Bay when the launch pad was set up. As a matter of fact, there aren't any flamingos there anymore. Friends of the Earth and the World of Wildlife Fund got a bit upset about it, but you don't see them. You don't see them going around murdering people. Force 3 is a different matter. What do you know about them? Corey scowled. Not a lot. Before this year, nobody had ever heard of them. Then a woman in Germany wrote an article about them in the Spiegel. And a few days later, she was shot in the street. The same thing happened in London just over a week ago. A chap by the name of Max Weber denounced them at a conference on international security and got blown up as a result. We're looking into both deaths right now. That's why Miss Jones is in Berlin. Force 3 seem to be something quite new. Eco-terrorists, I suppose that's what you'd call them. It's all very alarming. What about Casper? Apart from what you told us, we hardly know anything about him. Well, he should be easy to enough to catch. There was some netted piles of legs from the start. The tattoos, with a face like his, you'll be able to spot him a mile away. At least we know what we're looking for. As for Drevin, he can take care of himself. I imagine he's got plenty of security out on Flamingo Bay. Our real worry is that Force 3 might have a crack on at Archangel. They've already blown up a car manufacturing plant, a research centre, and quite a few other installations. Of course, they'll have their work cut out. After all, Archangel is 300 miles up in outer space. But none of this is any concern of yours. Cordy stood up. You did a super good job, Alex, he said. I'm sure Drevin is enormously grateful. I wouldn't be surprised if a large queue didn't turn up in the post. At the very least, you might get a couple of tickets to see Stratford East play. I don't want to check you, Alex said. I just wanted to go home. I hear the doctor says you can leave this evening. Cordy slid the recorder into his pocket. I've stayed long enough, he said. Very good to see you, Alex. I'm sure we'll meet again. Alex remembered the words as he ate his scrambled eggs. Did Cordy really think he would ever work for MI6 again? If so, he was very much mistaken. The strange thing was, he could think of dozens of boys at Brooklyn School who probably dreamt about being a spy. They'd imagined it would be fun. Alex had discovered the unpleasant reality. He'd been hurt, threatened, manipulated, shot at, beaten up and almost killed. Alex had discovered the unpleasant reality. He'd been hurt, threatened, manipulated, shot at, beaten up and almost killed. He'd found himself in a world where he couldn't believe anybody, and where nothing was quite what it seemed, and he'd had enough. In 2 years he would be taking his GCSEs. From now on he was going to keep his head down, and next time for terrorist kidnappers broke into a hospital, he'd simply turn over and go back to sleep. Jack Starbright had finished eating a nice read as she hadn't said a word since she had sat down. He'd been very quiet when she picked him up from the hospital too. Jack, are you angry with me? He asked. No, she said, but a single word told him the exact opposite. I put down his knife and fork. I'm sorry, Jack sighed. I don't know what to say to you. Alex, she said, I'm not sure I can look after you anymore. Are you going back to America? No, I don't know. She looked at him sadly. You have no idea what it's been like for me recently. First you tell me you're going on a vacation in Venice. The next thing I know, you got caught up with some international band of criminals, and then you get shot. How do you think I felt when they told me? But somehow you pulled through, and you're in hospital, and another kid, and any other kid would just stay there and get better, but not you. You have to take on a gang of kidnappers, and nearly get killed all over again. It wasn't my fault, I protested. Yes, it happened. I know, that's what I tell myself. But the fact is, I feel completely useless. He fell silent. I don't want to be sitting here next time when they tell me you didn't make it. I couldn't bear that. Max went over to her. There isn't going to be a next time. He said, I am not useless, Jack. I don't know what I'd do without you. There's no one else to look after me. And it's not just that. I sometimes think you're the only person who really knows me. I only feel normal when I'm with you. Jack stood up and gave him a hug. Just my luck, she said ruefully. All the 14-year-olds in the world, and I end up looking after you. The phone rang in the hall. I'll get it, he said. Alice took the plate over to the dishwasher and began to stack them. About 2 minutes later, Jack came back in. There was no look on his face. Who is it? He asked. He was for you. I don't believe it. That was Nico Lee Trevin. He rang himself. Yes, he's invited you to have tea with him this afternoon. He's giving a press conference at the waterfront. I'll tell anyone didn't know if you'd come along and meet him afterwards. What did you say? Well, I told him I'd ask you, and he said he'd send a car. She shrugged. Guess he expected you to say yes. I thought for a moment. Mr. Boyce had said that Drevin would probably get in touch. Do you think I should go? Jack sighed. I don't know. I suppose he wants to thank you after all. You saved him £1 million, and he stopped his assignment getting hurt. I just remembered poor Drevin. I wonder if the other boy would be at the hotel. I could call him back and say you're too tired, Jack added. For a moment I was tempted. The last time we met a multi-billionaire, he would be dismayed and quite the experience, and nearly killed him. On the other hand, this was different. Drevin was a target, and was a man. It was a man called Casper who was the enemy. It was fair enough that Drevin should want to meet him after what had happened. I felt awkward about saying no. Sometimes it's tiniest things that can mean the difference between life and death. A few centimeters of curb has saved Alex when he stepped off the pavement on Liverpool Street. Just as a sniper fired at him. Now 2 words were going to drag him back into the world he thought he left behind. Let's go. Right, everybody, that's the end of my video. So goodbye, everyone, and thank you for listening to this.